Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is Crystal Bergman. I am the Energy Team Lead in the Office of Economic Development at HUD. I also manage HUD's Renew 300 initiative. So I'm excited. We have a good group of participants today and an awesome group of folks who are joining us on this call to talk about solar energy for public housing authorities. So just to give a second of background, the Renew 300 initiative began in 2013 as an effort to increase the use of on-site or community solar at federally assisted housing, including housing authorities. We know that in many places, renewable energy can make sense. It can save money for the organization. It can contribute to the local economy and have a positive impact on the community. So the purpose of this webinar today, as it says on the slide, is to provide an overview of solar photovoltaic project development opportunities for public housing authorities with a framework for planning and pursuing viable financing options and projects. So a lot of the information might be useful for more broadly affordable housing or multifamily housing, but is designed around public housing authorities specifically. And as I said, I'm Crystal Bergman. I work for HUD in the Office of Economic Development. And then I'm joined by some really great presenters today. So Ben Foster from ICF has been involved with our Renew 300 initiative from the beginning, providing a lot of the direct technical assistance to housing authorities and multifamily organizations across the country that have worked to go solar. And then Dick Santangelo may be a name that's familiar to some of the folks on the phone. He has a long history in energy, engineering, and public housing as a former HUD employee as well. So he works for Apollo Engineering and is working with ICF on this webinar. And then we're also joined by our sort of expert at the housing authority level, Bob Havlicek, who is kind of a pioneer on this work and has done, did renewable energy before it was cool back in 2011, I believe. So he'll talk a little bit about the housing authority in the county of Santa Barbara and some of their work on renewable energy and solar. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ben Foster to get started.
Great, thank you, Crystal. Hi, everyone. This is Ben Foster. During today's webinar, we're excited to have you join us, and we're going to go through, first off, the reasons why PHAs are pursuing solar power, including overview of solar project development and some common barriers that we see across different housing organizations. We'll look at financing options available for them and the project economics and HUD incentives and approval process related to project financing. And then we'll also look at some successful case studies. And then we'll finish up today by answering questions that you submit during the webinar. So we definitely encourage you to submit those questions through the Q&A chat box within the WebEx platform. And we'll bring those together and then address those after the end of the main content of the presentation. So first, let's set the stage for the financing topic by providing context for exactly what we mean by solar projects. We see three common solar project types. These are based on energy offset agreements or arrangements. The first and typical and most common that we'll focus on primarily in this webinar is on-site single meter solar. This may also be called net metering. You've probably heard that before. This is where a solar project on-site directly reduces the building load. There are two other variations of this and alternatives that exist in some markets. They're not necessarily widely available in all different utility territories across the country, but you may have heard of these as virtual net metering or remote net metering or some other version of that. One would be on-site shared solar, where there's a single array that is then spread across multiple meters at one or more PHA buildings to help reduce the load on multiple meters. And another version of off-site shared solar or community solar is where there's a single array that's not on the PHA facility, but then can be subscribed to and help offset individual energy load on multiple meters. So again, there are three different examples and types that are out there that you may have encountered or you may see in different literature, but we're going to focus on the first one, the on-site single meter solar primarily. Doesn't mean just one project, it means each individual project site offsets the single building meter's load. So why do we see public housing authorities pursuing solar power in the first place? Well, first and foremost and most common, especially given the tight budgets that face PHAs these days, are to reduce energy costs and also to provide revenue opportunities via leasing agreements where a third party comes in and looks at the solar potential on your facility and can perhaps provide some revenue and leases to develop those projects on your behalf or in collaboration with your organization. Now, there are also, from time to time, limited opportunities for incentive programs that are targeted specifically for affordable housing or that sector in different parts of the country. And when those come up and that helps to reduce costs and help to accelerate project development, then those are opportunities as well for PHAs to look at and consider and to take action where the economics get that much better through incentive programs. Of course, the Renew 300 program that Crystal was describing and is in charge of has goals that some of you may have made commitments to, but solar power is certainly a great resource and a great opportunity to achieve your clean energy or environmental goals as an organization and as a city and as a region. And then finally, an important mission-driven goal or set of goals is to ensure maximum benefits for residents and the community at large. That includes ways to engage and educate residents on solar power, how it works, how it can benefit them, and how it can benefit their community. And then for larger scale projects, directly create jobs and training opportunities for residents. So these are all different ways and drivers for public housing authority to pursue solar projects. Now, from a technical perspective, more specifically, what types of solar applications should you consider? Well, what we see here from a technical perspective is the opportunity to capture underutilized space and to put that to productive use using solar power as a long-term asset. This is a 20 to 25-year asset that can be installed on rooftops and rooftop solar arrays, either on a sloped roof, as you see on the left from Denver Housing Authority, or on a flat roof on larger, more urban buildings. And then also for covered parking, those can be called solar canopies. And these different types of systems are directly installed on-site by a third-party solar developer. And the covered parking has the additional benefits of providing shelter from the sun, rain, snow, et cetera, different weather events for both staff and residents. So we see this as an increasingly popular opportunity to use additional space and provide ancillary benefits. So it's important to look at, from a technical perspective, what's possible across your entire portfolio. And as you evaluate and pursue your project development options, who should be involved? Well, of course, it takes a team, internal and external parties and contacts and decision makers. On the operations and management side, of course, that team is responsible for facility and impacts of your facility and operations, so getting them involved early to look at what solar projects might be viable from a technical perspective and from a maintenance perspective long-term. How does that impact their operation and what input would they have? On capital planning, and you'll hear more about this from Dick Santangelo soon, it's important for them to be a key part of this because they're integral to not only the building portfolio and financing opportunities, but also to coordinate on project and retrofits and improvements to your buildings and facilities. Making sure that gets coordinated from the beginning and over long term is going to be a key to success. The accounting and finance teams and responsibility is typically part of the evaluation up front on the economic potential, but then also to help negotiate contracts as the process goes forward and you select a developer and select a different financing mechanism or a financing mechanism that makes sense for you. And then the long-term management and oversight to ensure that the benefits that you expected to receive that you actually realize. On the legal and procurement side, they're important both before a project goes out to bid to make sure that there's full and fair competition and the process goes the way it's supposed to and is required to, both from a HUD perspective and state and local. And then also during the process to ensure that vendors and offers and financing are compared head-to-head. On the security side, it's important on planning as well for them to be involved early to look at safety of not only the solar systems that may be installed on site, but then making sure that residents and staff also during operations are familiar with how it works and how to make sure that they stay safe around the equipment. Resident engagement is a key function that is important both before a project gets approved to move forward so that they know what's going to happen, they can support it and begin that learning process and engagement process. During construction, there will be some impacts, just like there would with any building retrofits or upgrades and so on. So helping them understand in advance what to expect and setting the right process and timetable out. And then during operations long term so that they can, again, know how to interact with the systems that are there as needed. And then especially for larger PHAs, the board of directors are a very important group, not only to keep informed up front, but then are required as part of the approval process, and then to help spread the word about what's happening and the commitments that the PHA is making and the actions they're taking. Externally, of course, HUD is a key part of the equation, and Dick Santangelo will talk about the approval process and how that works and how it interrelates to different financing opportunities. Your electric utility is going to be part of the effort from an interconnection process, but also they can help you model the different rates, electricity rates that will save you the most amount of money based on the type of solar system that you may have installed. Your community stakeholders, externally, there's lots of resources in many communities and advocates to help you understand what's possible, to bring together different parties that are necessary to making a successful development, and also to help guide the effort so that it moves forward as quickly as possible. And then, of course, solar developers, those are the folks that are going to be doing the installation and bringing together the financing of other parties ultimately to make sure that it gets done right and it gets done as you expect it to. So a cooperative approach with them is important, again, within whatever procurement requirements or procurement process that you have underway. And then working across the country on affordable housing projects and PHA projects, we see 5 common barriers to development, but also solutions to overcome each one of them, fortunately. First and foremost, and this is directly a driver for this webinar, is the limited availability of capital funding internally to a PHA to do solar projects. There are lots of different requirements and demands on the capital that is available. It's very precious for building maintenance and upgrades and development over time. So it's important to look for financing partners to minimize the capital requirements and capture tax benefits as well, depending on the structure that you may be able to put in place. We find that individual project size on each specific building, you saw a couple of examples earlier on a technical perspective, is fairly small to medium size if you compare it to typical commercial projects. That's on average, they may be less than 150 kilowatts in size for any given building, any single building. And in that case, if you were to develop those individually, one project this year, another project next year, another project the year after, that's going to drive up your transaction costs and administrative burden of having to go and procure those one at a time, year after year. And from a development perspective, that's also going to increase the cost because your solar partner would not be able to purchase in bulk, would not be able to schedule a team and bring together the financing in an aggregated way that would help drive down the costs for your solar system. So it has a dual cost to it. But instead, what we see a much better approach is to screen your entire portfolio of sites and then to group as many of those as are viable to help drive down costs and reach your goals faster and more effectively. A third area, of course, is economic viability, and I mentioned earlier the limited time availability of incentives. So it's important to look at the economic potential of each of those different sites once you've identified them technically to go through what looks from a cost perspective most attractive, and where, for instance, if you're paying a very low rate on certain meters, it's going to be harder to find a viable project than if you're paying a high rate at others, or if there's an incentive that's available for a certain scale of system or a certain zone from a utility perspective or utility territory. You're going to want to understand that so you can pursue the ones that are most viable to avoid dropouts later, because that's going to increase cost and risk if you have to drop projects from a bundle or from a portfolio later in the process. We typically don't find that the staff available, whether it's at PHAs or other multifamily affordable housing partners, that they have any spare time. I'm sure none of you on the call have a lot of spare time to pursue these projects and to do all this work by yourself from scratch. These are complicated topics. It's not only the technical aspect, but the financing aspect and economic aspect. The good thing is that HUD has a tremendous resource library. It's available with lots of self-service tools and templates and examples, case studies, and we provide links to those at the end of this webinar. And there's also a number of resources that are available for technical assistance at low cost or no cost that are available on a national or a state or a local basis that you can tap into to help augment your staff and augment that expertise that you may have the desire and the goal to move forward, but maybe not the availability internally to make that happen. And it's important to review because sometimes there may be a shortcut that's presented to you of an arrangement with a partner, an unsolicited proposal of some sort. It's important to pause when you see those and to review those to make sure it's an authorized type of transaction and a legal structure for you, so that you bring in an expert or experts to help review those, so you don't, again, inadvertently go on a path that may create some issues later on in terms of your ability to complete that deal. And then finally, looking at parallel assets or program impacts, an example of that would be if you're planning, you found a great location, the rates indicate you could save a lot of money, but you have planned a roof replacement on that building in 5 years. So you wouldn't next year want to put a solar project on the roof and then have to move it, take it down, replace it later. That's going to drive up your costs, not only for the solar project itself, but also for the roof replacement. So it's really important to coordinate that across the other programs and leaders. Now, in the smaller PHAs, the folks that are involved in that may be in fairly constant contact anyway, or it may be that department that's focusing on solar project development. But in the larger PHAs, those departments may not always coordinate as closely as they could on these sort of new initiatives, and so it's important to reach out and get connected that way. So with that background on common concerns, common approaches to solar projects, hopefully that tees up the further discussion. And now I'm going to turn this over for a deep dive into project financing, specifically for PHAs. I'll give this over to Dick Santangelo.
Thank you, Ben. Appreciate it. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. Show me the money. And let's take a look at some different options for solar financing and solar opportunities. All energy projects, including renewables, are about economics. Does the project make sense financially? Is the project in the best interest of my housing authority? And then what are the financial venues that are available to my PHA for financing solar? Most EPCs, and those are energy performance contracts, are long-term lease purchase agreements. PHA leases the equipment, and then at the end of the contract period, the PHA owns the equipment for some nominal amount. There's significant benefits with EPC. They're in a competitive marketplace, both for the energy services company and services to support a solar project or an energy project. And there's also a financing market available. Also, EPCs maximize the energy efficiency opportunities by aggregating all the savings in a project. So that's real important. However, there's risks associated with EPCs. They're long-term commitments, usually 12 to 20 years. There could be a 3 to 5 year blackout period in terms of the financing where a loan maybe can't be paid off, and we recommend that in any financing with or without solar that these blackout periods be avoided. They can be negotiated. And then also that there are payment penalties, and they also can be negotiated. There's also a requirement with EPCs for Section 30 requirements, and some of you may be familiar with that. As part of a loan agreement, a financing company may put a lien on a piece of property on the equipment itself, and in that case, HUD then has to be involved to approve any kind of loan so that there's no conflict with your annual contributions contract. So pluses and minuses with EPC. Power purchase agreements are one of the more popular financing vehicles for solar. Through a PPA, a PHA may offer rooftop or land to a utility provider that installs and maintains solar panels for a designated contract period. In exchange, the PHA will typically receive discounted electricity during that contract term, and sometimes may even enter a lease-to-own the arrangement or gain ownership of the solar panels following the contract term. For PHAs not interested in purchasing and installing their own on-site solar, PPAs allow housing authorities to begin utilizing renewable energy technology with no upfront costs or maintenance expertise needed by the PHA themselves. So the benefits are turnkey operation, and the third party, the independent party, owns and operates the system. The risks, like anything, it's a long-term financial commitment. Also, if the rates go down, you may be locked in at a higher rate. So again, advice and counsel is good even when entering a PPA. Capital funds, we're all familiar with capital funds. We're all familiar with capital fund financing. Solar system would be an eligible expense just like it was a boiler. The benefits are that you would own it outright. There would be no financing cost if you used, and if capital funds were available, you would own it outright, so there'd be no financing cost. But the risk, obviously, as we're all aware, is that you would maintain the system, and right now there appears to be a limited availability of funds for these kinds of projects. Low-income housing tax credits make up the largest single funding resource for developing affordable housing in the United States. Tax credits are available annually by states, local housing agencies, to project developers, to raise private capital that can be used to build affordable housing. So that's a big benefit. However, because of the tax reform that's pending, what we see as kind of a risk is that many investors are playing it safe, so to speak, in terms of how they get invested with any kind of projects or solar projects in particular. And so right now, this is basically up in the air and to be seen at this time. The community or shared projects provide opportunities to aggregate customer demand. Shared solar programs can reduce the financial and technical barriers to going solar. Instead of acting alone as a PHA to purchase panels and hire professionals, you can do it as a group and you share the cost among all the participants. Some PHAs or local communities may actually have vacant lots or brownfields, which are great sources for solar locations. The benefits to a community or shared project is that you have shared costs, reduced financial and technical barriers. The risks are there are rules to play in the sandbox. Your board, your staff needs to be comfortable with any requirements that could infringe on your annual contributions contract and just your in-house public housing rules and regulations. Federal or state grants, the benefits, obviously, free money is always welcome to the party. Anytime that you can get a free grant will certainly offset the cost of any kind of solar project. The risks associated with state and federal budgets is the availability, so that may be limited, and also there may be some eligibility requirements, so you have to really check that out. But grants and utility rebates are a great source of revenue. Let's talk for a minute about HUD's rate reduction incentive. This is pretty important. In 2014, HUD made it financially advantageous to pursue a rate reduction and consumption reduction activities as part of a project or a part of an energy performance contract. Prior to the notice that came out in 2014, the frozen rolling base incentive as part of an EPC was penalized by a rate reduction. We'll talk about that, how that happens in a minute. Savings under a frozen rolling base incentive is based on consumption. So if my consumption goes down, the amount that I save times the rate, I actually get a very lucrative benefit. However, if the rate goes down because I've reduced the rate, what happens is then the savings associated with the frozen rolling base can actually affect any kind of debt service. And so you had one incentive working against the other. To encourage the use of renewable energy sources like solar, HUD's Public Housing Notice 2014-18 addressed this conflict. And it said basically that we recognize the benefit of a frozen rolling base consumption that's part and parcel to an EPC, but we also want to encourage the rate reduction. And so if you do solar or any kind of renewable in conjunction with an EPC, we will let you keep 100% of the savings. That's a big benefit because up until this time, if you decided to do a rate reduction, the Housing Authority, if you got $1, you had to split that with HUD. It was a 50-50 split. So under an EPC, just as an example, at the bottom you could see that if I did solar as part of an energy performance contract and I had a 1,500 kilowatt-hour baseline, I saved 4 cents, it would be $60, and the Housing Authority gets to keep the full $60. Without an EPC, you would actually only save $30. You'd save half of that. So again, the notice recognized the value of renewables and also said we recognize the value of the energy performance contract and the frozen rolling base incentive, and therefore said, listen, we'll give you both. Keep in mind, however, that a rate reduction incentive must be approved annually by HUD and is subject to proration like most of the other incentives. Power purchase agreement greater than 5 years will require a HUD approval for a couple of reasons. One is HUD wants to make sure that there was free and open competition for a power purchase agreement that goes beyond 5 years, and also that there's no conflict, again, with anything in the annual contributions contract. And again, also important, make sure that in securing solar that you follow your PHA procurement rules. Okay, let's talk about some economics here. Location matters. How often have you heard the phrase location, location, location when it comes to real estate investments? Well, it's also true when you're talking about solar. Location matters in solar because of regulations, utility policies, incentives provided by the state. Equally important is that you have contractors that are familiar with local weather conditions, technical and legal issues unique to the local area. So all of these weigh into the factors and should be considered if you're thinking about solar. Desiree, D-S-I-R-E, and that's a site you'll see listed as a resource, is a great website to see how proactive your state is in engaging in solar. Also keep in mind that just because your state is not green on this map doesn't mean your solar is not, that solar in your area is not an option. We're going to talk a little bit about an example in Tennessee, Cleveland, Tennessee, and it may require that your PHA be more innovative in searching out financing opportunities. Tennessee is not a particularly solar proactive state, but we'll show you how it works out at the Cleveland Housing Authority. So on the right-hand side, you'll see factors, and these are the factors that enter into the kind of the color scheme that you see on the map of the United States. Policy factors such as renewable portfolio standards, net metering have a major effect and actually combine to make up about 50% of the scoring. Solar incentive factors like tax credits and rebates probably make up about 40%. So let's look at a few of the criteria that you might not be familiar with. Let's look at the renewable portfolio standard. So this is usually a state legislation that requires a certain percentage of all the energy generation in a state has to come from solar. If a state didn't have any legislation related to this, it would probably get a red score. Solar carve-out is a state solar incentive program that provides panel owners some credits. They call them SRECs, or solar renewable credits, for the panels that they have, and also these SRECs have some monetary value because they can be sold. Interconnectivity, very important. If I can't hook to the utilities, solar is not going to do me very good in terms of net metering, which we'll talk about in a minute. So interconnectivity is the ease with which solar systems can plug into the grid and send power to the utility company. Performance payments or credits for solar panel performance. And net metering is the ability to sell excess electricity back to the grid. All of these are important considerations and to understand, you know, as you consider solar, because it's going to certainly affect your return on your investment. Let's look at and I mentioned this before, let's do some side-by-side. So we talked about some factors. Let's see how they compare. So Tennessee, a great state, however, ranks 40th out of 50 states. California is 16th for the various factors that we just discussed. Let's look at two states that have different solar scores and see how the Cleveland Housing Authority in Cleveland, Tennessee, and the Housing Authority of the County of Santa Barbara use their solar opportunities. Key to both projects, and this is fundamental in any kind of energy project and solar project, key to both projects is you got to have a champion inside the Housing Authority, somebody who believes in it and somebody who wants to make it happen. Paul Dellinger is the executive director in the Cleveland Housing Authority, and he's a strong proponent of solar at his PHA. And another reason for picking Cleveland, I wanted to demonstrate that a small housing authority like Cleveland in a state with a low solar score can do solar with a solar champion and an innovative consultant. Cleveland is looking to do a solar project as part of an energy performance contract, and they're doing this with Johnson Controls. As you can see on the surface, Tennessee doesn't have a strong support in the way of legislation, rebates, utility cooperation to encourage solar. Even worse, and you may not think that this is a negative factor, but even worse, depending on how you look at it, the cost of electricity is the second lowest in the country. In Tennessee, it's about 10 cents a kilowatt hour, and the range nationally is about 8.37 to about 37, 38 cents a kilowatt hour. So the low score in Tennessee is the result primarily of low utility prices and their policies. So Tennessee gets an overall D on the solar report card, 40 of 50 states. California, on the other hand, gets a score of B. And we'll talk about Santa Barbara a little bit later in the presentation. Santa Barbara has the largest solar project in the PHA inventory. This is a credit to the innovation of Bob Havlicek and his team. And we mentioned earlier that Bob is on the line today to answer your questions later on. And I know you're just dying to know who's number one. So in case you're wondering, the states of Massachusetts, number 1, New Jersey, number 2, Rhode Island, number 3, Oregon, number 4, New York, number 5, and the state of Maryland are the top 6 solar states. Now, just as an example, Maryland has proposed legislation that will make solar even more lucrative than it currently is. In Maryland, Project Solshine with the Maryland State Incentives is an initiative to bring solar opportunities to HUD-assisted properties, including Maryland PHAs. So you can see that some of these states are actively involved in generating state legislation that furthers the technology related to solar. So at first glance, you might think, boy, I don't know, I'm in Tennessee and solar is not feasible. Well, let's look a little closer. We are in Cleveland, Tennessee. So why is Cleveland Housing Authority considering solar? Because they believe in it. Phase 1 is a $2 million energy performance contract with traditional water, lighting, HVAC measures. Construction will be completed within the next 6 months. Johnson Controls is designing a 600 kilowatt ground array solar project, which involves, and this is the creative part, which involves leasing the land to a solar developer who would own the system. The solar developer would get any tax credits, depreciation, sell the electricity back to the grid. The Cleveland Housing Authority would get lease revenues from the land and lower electricity costs for PHA common areas. So the phase 2 is a solar EPC project, a work in progress, and some of the excess savings from the initial EPC, from the water measures and HVAC, will be used to help offset some of the costs as they develop. The solar system is expected to generate about $81,000 a year. The approximate cost is about $2.1 million. It has a useful life of about 20 years. And the status of the project is HUD has already approved the EPC project, and they're in the construction phase for the EPC, and the phase 2 solar project is in the design stage. And we'll talk a little bit more about EPCs because sometimes it's real beneficial to do them in phases and generate excess cash flow in phase 1 so that you can do some of the secondary priorities in subsequent phases. Okay, so let's dive down a little bit further here. Let's look at some preliminary economic evaluation metrics, okay? And we're going to talk through these. Specifically, let's look at net present value and return on an investment. Now, these are common metrics that are used in evaluating, where should I spend a dollar? Am I better to spend a dollar and invest it here, or should I spend it over here? So we'll make some assumptions. The net present value calculates the present value of a future cash flow investment with the premise, with the understanding that money today is worth more than money in the future. And the criteria here is we're looking for a positive number. So when we put our numbers in the Excel calculation, which is relatively simple, we want to make sure that we get a positive number. Return on investment is a measure of gain or loss relative to the money I invest. Now, in public housing, we're not necessarily looking on a return on investment, but it is a good metric, and you can pretty much, I use 10% because I think that's a pretty commercial kind of approach. You could use less, which makes the project seem more feasible. But in our particular case, we use 10%. We calculated the value of the electricity being produced using PV watts. PV watts is a very simple tool. It's an easy web application developed by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory that estimates the value of electricity from a grid-connected roof or ground-mounted photovoltaic system, based on just a few simple inputs. So in the case of Cleveland, we compared. We said, all right, well, what do I got? I have this, and there are certain factors that I consider. So in the case of Cleveland, we compared taking out a loan to purchasing a system through a power purchase agreement. And when you crunch the numbers in Excel, we see that the net present value for purchasing a system was negative, and the ROI was positive. And this is probably due to the low cost of electricity that has a real impact on the net present value. In the case of the power purchase agreement, we calculated a positive value for the net present value because the third party is going to get tax credits and depreciation, which the PHA would not. So the ROI is significantly higher, and for that reason, the better choice in just this example is to go the route of the power purchase agreement. So you can see that it's not a very complicated calculation to do this, kind of a go, no-go kind of thing. It gets more complicated depending on how what the system involves, the size of the system, and certainly in the case of Santa Barbara, the complexities would be a lot more. But in the case of Cleveland and the desire to do solar, this was a way to say, hey, I think we can do this. And so, again, a small housing authority doing solar. So let's look at the benefits to the Cleveland Housing Authority. So we have some reduced operating costs. There's net metering permits the CHA to purchase a lower locked rate for PHA paid utilities. Remember too, though, that even with the rate reduction that CHA has to get the rate reduction approved on an annual basis. It's also subject to proration, so there's balance with everything. CHA has a revenue generator in terms of its lease agreement with the third party, so there's some money to be made by the CHA. And there's no upfront capital cost. The developer is responsible for the insurance and the maintenance of the project. So for Cleveland, they kind of hit all the goals that they kind of set out. They wanted solar, and they found a way to make it happen. Let's look at the Housing Authority of the County of Santa Barbara. So we looked at a small housing authority. Let's see, go to the other side of the scale and look at a housing authority that has gone very innovative and actually has the largest project in the PHA inventory. And I selected them principally because the case study incorporates several of the financing approaches we discussed earlier. And they employed all of those and some combination of those, grants and all of that, power purchase agreements, under the umbrella of an energy performance contract. So the Housing Authority of Santa Barbara, the largest solar project in the PHA inventory. As such, the complexities and technical issues are not typical of what you might see in a smaller project. Many of the grants that they had, like the ARA grant and the 1603, are no longer available. But the project itself is a good example of a point-in-time project, meaning that you take advantage of the available grants and incentives that are at that time available to you. So again, Santa Barbara entered into an energy performance contract. The energy performance contract, as we said earlier, can be staged in phases to better organize the project, generate cash flow from fast payback measures like water and lighting, and the excess cash flow can be used to address the secondary priorities that maybe didn't pencil out when the initial project was put together. Prior to the solar project, Santa Barbara modernized over 428 units with efficiency lighting, windows, furnaces, in a $5.2 million EPC with Constellation, the energy services company, Constellation. The excess energy savings from the EPC, we'll call that a phase 1, was leveraged to implement the solar project into a phase 2. And then the EPC project was extended. Remember, we talked about the fact that it's 12 to 20 years. They extended it from 12 to 20 years. So what did that do? Well, that actually extended the cash flow, meaning I got more money over time, which made the solar project even that much more practical. And so that was the way that they basically were able to put the project together. Recall the scorecard we spoke about earlier. California solar score is a B and ranks 16th. California has one of the highest utility costs, over 16 cents a kilowatt hour, making solar by itself a great investment in savings. The Santa Barbara solar project encompassed 21 multifamily affordable housing properties, 863 units. It had 7,200 panels, produced 1.7 megawatts. Part of the complexity in this project is that it bridged 3 utility jurisdictions, which made it difficult to coordinate. When we talked about interconnectivity, net metering, you know, when you get into the different utilities of the different utility companies, it becomes even more complex. But it made the project challenging. But at the end of the day, they succeeded. And the most significant part of this project is that they were basically able to produce 100% of the tenant energy consumption. So that's pretty impressive to go, you know, 100% paid through the solar. Total system cost was approximately $12 million. 40% of the cost came from California initiatives, rebates. 30% was from ARA, and 30% again was from another source of California grants. So what did we learn? We covered a lot of ground today. We talked about a lot of financing approaches. We talked about some successful projects. So what lessons have we learned from a small project in Tennessee and the largest project in the PHA inventory? Basically, 22% of operating expenses in public housing is attributed to utility costs. Solar systems can reduce PHA operating expenses, and in this period, in this time that we all face, and particularly public housing authorities, this is a really important criteria. What is it that I can do to reduce my operating expenses? In some instances, they've been able to generate revenue. So, for example, in the case of Cleveland, they were able to generate some revenue because they leased the land. Project financing, financing options exist for solar with or without an energy performance contract. Power purchase agreements are probably the preferred financing approach for standalone solar. But at the end of the day, you have to ask yourself the question, what is in the best interest of the PHA? Location considerations are critical. HUD's rate reduction and the EPC incentives, if you go the route of an EPC, are real motivators. So in addition to the benefits to the PHA, let's talk about some of the economic development opportunities. I think this is pretty important, and Section 3 is always a consideration within PHAs. 1 out of 50 new jobs in 2016 was related to solar. Solar jobs increased by 40% in the last 4 years. Solar provides an opportunity to meet Section 3 requirements, provide training, jobs to residents, and resident-owned businesses. And so then what did we, stepping back, so what did the case studies tell us? Basically, Cleveland demonstrated that small PHAs can do solar. Santa Barbara demonstrated that net zero is possible with skilled technical and a financial team. And in more complex projects, you really need to have contingency plans. You don't know what you don't know sometimes, and Bob could speak to that if anybody has any questions, and basically trust the process. Let's talk about, okay, so I'm into doing a solar. I think I could line up financing. What are the HUD requirements? What's related to both an EPC with solar, or if I wanted to do solar by itself? So slide 25 depicts the EPC process, including a solar project, and it starts with a discussion at the field office, okay? The reason why you start with the field office is because they can assist with any of the subsequent processing that's going to occur. And also, they can act as a sponsor for discussions with the Energy Center, headquarters, or whoever, is questioning the project itself. So it's always good to get your field office on board. There are two activities in the traditional EPC process that require HUD approval. The first is the approval of the RFP, the request for proposal, to secure an energy services company. HUD wants to be sure that the RFP language invites fair and open competition. The second approval is the Energy Center's assessment of the project details. HUD wants to be sure that the project costs can be paid from anticipated energy and water savings, and to that end, HUD's going to want to see the investment-grade energy audit, so what was identified as energy requirements in this project, what is the cost summary, what ECMs, what energy conservation measures are included, are the costs reasonable, they're going to want to look at cash flow, can the energy savings pay for the project, amortization, how long is it going to take to finance, consumption baselines, how are they determined, Section 30, as we spoke about, if it's required and there's liens, they'll want to see the contract between the energy services company and the Public Housing Authority. And then in particular with the solar, depending on whether the solar is going to go, if it's a PPA and it's going to go 5 years or more, then HUD's going to want to make sure again about the procurement of that solar and also about any implications in that power purchase agreement that might constrict or restrict HUD's ability on the annual contributions contract. There's back and forth with the field office, the Energy Center. Those of you who have done energy performance contracts know about this. Issues are resolved, and once the issues are resolved, the HUD field office will issue a notice to proceed, and this can take somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 to 4 months, basically depending on the backlog within HUD and also the project complexity. For a standalone solar, the project needs to go to the field office, again, is notified of the PHA's intention. Again, the field office is interested to ensure that the RFP process provides free and open competition. The field office, headquarters, or even the Office of General Counsel is going to want to review the terms of the PA to ensure there aren't any issues that conflict with provisions in the annual contributions contract. And revisions as necessary are made. Field office issues a notice to proceed. Process can take somewhere between 2 to 3 months depending on the backlog, project complexity, and OGC's schedule. And I'll turn it back to Ben.
Great. Thanks, Dick. I appreciate that. And that was, I think, an excellent not only overview of the different models and approaches and how it relates to PHAs, but the case studies and examples that help to illustrate how that works in real life. So I think that we certainly hope this webinar has provided a sound base of information to get started looking at solar opportunities for your PHA and ways to move forward. So if you're just getting started, the first step would be to get informed. Contact your HUD field office, as Dick was just describing. Renew some of the great materials and resources that are available on the HUD Renew 300 site. research and learn from other PHAs that have gone through this process. You had 2 great examples here, but there are others, many others as well to learn from. And then find out what technical assistance might be available to help you hands-on through HUD or other entities, again, at a whether it's federal level, state, or local level. If you're already at some point in the process of evaluating the solar options that may be available for you, I think it's important to go back and revisit what you've learned and what you see today in terms of the economics that could work for you, the different types of financing, and making sure that you are really comparing those head-to-head and the different attributes to make sure that you're pursuing them in a way that is really a best practice for your situation. And if you've moved through that process as well, and you're looking at procuring a solar provider of some sort, given a financing approach that you're comfortable with, we'll review all of HUD's and state and local agency procurement requirements that apply to you and your PHA. Also, HUD has recently released, an RFP template and guidance that you could use, and there are other different resources specifically related to procurement that you can refer to on the HUD Renew 300 site. And then if you're looking for solar providers, as you heard earlier, it's important that they have local knowledge, but also there are a number of different national sources and statewide sources to seek qualified and cost-effective providers. And we have a number of links on ways to go through that process. So we've covered the topics that we wanted to so far within this webinar on financing for PHAs. Now let's address some of the questions that have come in. We've got a bunch of questions that have come in so far, which we're really happy to do. Happy to see those so far and to provide some responses. Feel free to continue to add those in, but I'll tee it off as we go forward so far. A couple of technical questions first, and then some of the questions came in on examples that were provided in Cleveland, Tennessee, and then in Santa Barbara. One of the questions that came in was on solar project asset lifetime. We talked about it typically from a planning perspective, looking at a 20 to 25-year lifetime. That's when typically the maximum duration of a power purchase agreement, your EPC, your other types of financing loans will be at that length or shorter. You may have heard from different industry sources that those panels could last even longer, maybe up to 30 or 40 years, and that's certainly possible. It's certainly the case. There are certainly solar projects that were done early days, a couple of decades ago, that are still in operation today. But those, what you'd want to look at that anything longer than a 20 or 25-year period as being an upside, meaning that if it performs for longer than the financing period that you have, and you've already seen all the benefits that you planned, then the rest is upside for energy that continues to produce and provide you with cost savings, but that you wouldn't have to pay for anymore. So I think that's key is to capture what you can over a 20 to 25-year lifetime and have upside and a positive outcome if it lasts longer than that, and if you have a facility that can continue to host it beyond that period of time. We had a couple of questions that came in on tax-related policy changes in the future. Those are things that are outside of the scope of this webinar and areas that we won't be covering today. We did have a question, however, on how ownership structures for a PHA and the nonprofit status of a PHA may, how that interacts in a little more detail with the tax benefits. We mentioned a couple different examples that it's possible under certain situations to capture tax benefits through the arrangement, and specifically in the example of a power purchase agreement. It's a simple question, but it has sort of a complicated answer on a national basis because the availability of PHAs varies, PPAs, power purchase agreements, varies by state, and so there's not one state or one answer from a utility perspective that applies to all areas. But in general, a third-party contractor, if they own the panels and own the system and sell you the power, they're a commercial entity, and they typically would be able to take advantage of the tax credits directly. So that's how a PHA can tap into that. But exactly the structure and what works best is going to be different in your situation, so it's hard to provide a uniform answer. I wanted to flip it over to Dick here for a couple of questions on the specific case studies, I think a couple of questions here came in from Cleveland, Tennessee, Dick. One was, if a PHA is in year 5 of an EPC, is that still viable to look at a phase 2? So I think the question is around the length of time, if it's, should a phase 2 be planned early, or is there some period after which you get a phase 1 underway that is optimal for a solar project to be added into a phase 2?
Okay, so a good question. So in developing an EPC, advice that I've given to Cleveland and other housing authorities is that you need to make the RFP as broad as possible, because again, you don't know what you don't know. You don't know what your strategic plan may be 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years from now. So you want to include language that allows you to expand the project in a way that you can address maybe priority 2. What I mean by priority 2 is things that don't pencil out in the first kind of go-around. Remember we said that energy savings has to pay for the project? And so initially you'll come in with maybe a conservative approach to where 10 of the 20 things you want done will pencil out, and so you'll do that. And you'll say, well, maybe, I'm thinking about solar. Maybe my state may be more positive, in the next coming years is pending legislation, whatever. By keeping your RFP broad enough, you're able to expand some of the work within certain boundaries, certain dollar amounts of your EPC. And so, yes, you could then decide that you want to do a phase 2. But always good to stay in touch with your field office, get their concurrence, get their support, and keep the initial RFP as broad as you can in doing the project. So if you've already have an EPC, you'd have to go back and look at the language. A specific example might be, let's say you have 10 amps. And in the first EPC, you said, I'm going to do work on 5 amps, and that's how you put the proposal out on the street. To add the other amps, you would not be able to do that because that would be a procurement issue. So that's why I would say in the initial RFP, you'd want to include all the amps, decide that you're going to do some work on some of them now and some of the work later, and that gives you some flexibility in terms of procurement so you don't have to go out and procure another contract. A long explanation because it's a complicated process, but I want to make sure I want to keep you out of trouble in terms of procurement guidelines.
Great. Thanks, Dick. There's a related question to this for Tennessee is for the PPA that they signed, was there any sort of special permission that was necessary? In other words, is the state of Tennessee or the utility territory they're in, do they have any restrictions on that type of arrangement? And I think on a national basis, certainly it varies by state and by utility territory within states. And there are over 3,000 different utility territories across the country, so that's a wide spread of arrangements or requirements that exist across the country. So it's really important to understand what the legality is and how easy it is or difficult or restrictive it is to get into a power purchase agreement before going through an RFP process or signing a contract, certainly. But for Tennessee, do you have any insight on any special process they had to go through?
I don't know the special process at this point. As I mentioned, the project is still in the design phase. And so what we're going to do is that we're waiting to get the initial phase 1 to know what the amount of money is that's going to come out that will be available through excess savings. And I know that we're working with TVA in terms of grants, but in terms of any specific restrictions or anything by the state, I'm not aware of any at this point in time.
Okay,
Hi,
great.
this is Allison. I'm going to add in one more comment, and this is based on general industry knowledge that I've heard from other folks outside of HUD and outside of public housing authorities working on power purchase agreements. Just because a contractor approaches a housing authority or you as a customer saying we have this great deal, do not assume it's legal. There have been situations where people have signed on the dotted lines, they've committed to purchasing the electricity or buying equipment, and the equipment gets installed and they can't connect it to the utility grid. So you need to work with the local utility company and figure out what the state rules are just to make sure the contracts are legal. And even though it might be legal in one state, it might not be permissible in a certain utility territory, and we're not going to be able to answer that question because in some cases it has to do with the age of the switchgear. So it's a very specific infrastructure question. So I definitely would encourage you to research that before pursuing an RFP, and most definitely before signing on the dotted line.
Great. Thanks, Allison.
Thanks, Allison.
So there's a question that came in as we're talking about resident benefits on how are savings passed on to residents, and does this create an issue essentially for public housing subsidies? Dick, would you like to address that one?
Yeah, so it does affect residents because it will affect their utility allowances. In the case of, and it's one reason why in the case of Tennessee, I mentioned that the common areas are going to be the benefit in terms of the net metering and the solar project itself. Sometimes what housing authorities will do is that as a result of the savings that they enjoy, they may do things for residents that recognize, the benefits of solar. In other words, it's kind of a shared benefit. That has been a lot of what's been happening with housing authorities. And so maybe it's a matter of, providing computer access, Wi-Fi, and those kinds of things. And it's one of the ways that housing authorities share the benefit that may come only to the housing authority. But the issue is primarily it's one of, it would affect the total tenant payment and could adversely affect the residents.
Great. Thanks, Dick.
Okay.
We have a couple questions on the RFP process, procurement, and choosing an installer as well. That's a little bit outside of the main focus of this webinar, which is on the financing aspect of it. Certainly very important topic, of course, to make sure you get that right. But I just want to address that because it's come up in a couple of questions. There's a new resource that's available, and I'm going to flip from the Q&A placeholder slide over to some of the HUD Renew 300 resources and others that we've linked to or mentioned in here. There's a new resource on Solar RFP Toolkit that includes a number of common terms and specifications and approach to evaluating solar projects from a pricing perspective and a performance perspective and a vendor qualifications perspective that we want to bring your attention to. It's called the Solar RFP Toolkit, and it's listed about halfway through this slide. That's a great resource we put together in collaboration with a number of different external multifamily affordable housing providers and HUD itself and other stakeholders. So while it's not applicable to all PHAs, the common terms and conditions and evaluation criteria on the performance side and on the solar installer selection criteria are in there. So I won't go into the details other than just to point you in that direction and provide that resource. There was a question, another question that came in on the HUD approval process or requirements if either non-program funds or private funds are the only funds being used. So I don't know, Dick, if you can describe that in some more detail since you were talking about the HUD approval process, like how that factors in.
I think in covering the funding options, I think we talked about the various sources of paying for the solar. Part of it can come, if it's part of an EPC, excess savings can be used to pay for it, to offset the cost. Of course, any kind of grants, as I mentioned in Tennessee, we're applying or looking to apply for a TVA grant to help offset some of the costs. So all those things are eligible opportunities to help offset the cost of the solar system. In terms of program funds, I mean, if you're talking about HUD funds, I mentioned capital funds are eligible, solar is an eligible expense under the capital funds, so capital funds could be used, although probably not the best, not the best choice for the use of the capital funds.
Right. I think the question here more specifically was on the HUD approval process required if non-program income or private funds are used, I guess solely. But this is one of the questions that just as an overall, we're going to review these, and as the slide deck will be shared subsequently, we'll also provide some answers and follow-ups to some of the other questions that we received that we might not get a chance to get to today. Let's see, Dick, there's another question that came in on any other examples of revenue that can be generated from PV development. I think you mentioned on an earlier slide, perhaps brownfield redevelopment, or, we talked a little bit about leasing. Could you talk a little bit more just of some of the major or more common ways that the PHA can derive revenue from PV development?
Those are getting lease, getting lease revenues is a key way that I've seen it done. It's possible too that maybe in some kind of community sharing project, let's say that the housing authority had land and they were able to develop a solar project, a community solar project, whereby they could actually sell or get the benefit of outside community interest using some of that solar. It may be a way to, one, offset the cost of the project, and then also to generate revenue for the housing authority itself. So I think that that's a pretty open area in terms of being creative. There's flexibility in doing that, and all of those I know are being done in some part or parcel around the country.
Great, thanks. A question that just came in was, have any PHAs joined into a co-op with other nonprofits? So I think if I read into that a little bit, that can PHAs sort of join into a cooperative effort, maybe regionally, with other nonprofits to try to coordinate activities or to form a buying group of some sort? So I think that's an interesting question.
Okay. I don't have any personal experience, but I do know that the state of Massachusetts has a number of initiatives, and they're passing legislation that's going to provide a lot of flexibility toward doing those kinds of projects, but I don't have any personal experience on that. Be happy to get back and let you know what is going on in Massachusetts.
Great, thanks. And I have experience working with collaborative procurement across nonprofits in different regions around the country, and know that certainly they can yield better results than going alone. We talked earlier about the average size, at least on any given facility, any given building, being fairly small, and aggregating those up in a bigger group definitely helps drive down costs and get more vendor interest and build a bigger funding pool that the developers can look out to help drive down costs and transaction costs, et cetera. But it's not simple, and it does take a lot of time and effort. But there are definitely some examples that we can probably pass back as well as the research in Massachusetts. There's a couple of questions that came in. I'm not sure exactly if we can answer these right now, but on community solar subscription. So we talked at the very beginning of some other opportunities outside of direct on-site project, and these are third-party owned and operated and maintained off-site, so not on your PHA property at all, where where a third party, maybe through utility or maybe directly through a solar developer that has community projects, can allow subscriptions to a portion of that array as a way to help reduce costs and reach clean energy goals. So it's not at all on your site, but it's a remote project. So one of the questions that came in, or a couple of questions related to that, is there an approval process that we can talk to that would fall into, since we didn't cover that as part of the on-site project development yet? I don't know, Dick, if you've got any.
Yeah, I would. Yeah, I would. You know, there's a lot of new ground being plowed in this area, and people are being creative and innovative. I think that the first thing to do is that if you have that opportunity in your community, again, you need to approach the HUD field office, okay? Because as Allison mentioned before, if there's any, you know, if there's any signatures, agreements, or whatever, one, you want to make sure that any procurement process, you're complying with any procurement process that HUD might have or your PHA may have, and then also again, the annual contributions contract is your contract with HUD for the subsidy they give you and the services you provide. And anything, and we can't foresee that because, again, people are creative and innovative. So I think it's on a case-by-case basis, and I would suggest that in that case that you approach the field office, you know, get them again as a sponsor to say, hey, this is a great idea, and then run it through headquarters and make sure that you've cleared all those hurdles so that, you know, in years to come, something doesn't come up to basically bite you. And you want to make sure that no, you know, there's no conflict with the annual contributions contract with HUD.
Great. Thanks, Dick. That definitely helps. It's definitely an emerging area, the community solar opportunity across the country in many markets. It's certainly not universal by any means, just like we talked about other utility programs and the available power purchase agreements. These are inherently utility by utility and have limited availability. So it's definitely hard to see a universal answer there, but we do see that as a growing interest and opportunity in more and more markets, more and more utility territories nationally. Let's see, there's another question that just came in. This may be, we may want to rephrase this or provide an answer that goes towards, you know, the typical process rather than what's possible. But if a PHA were to develop a solar project on a public housing site under a PPA model, so we talked about that as a way to generate revenue for the PHA, would that revenue generated be restricted for public housing uses, or is there a way to transfer that revenue to be used for unrestricted purposes? Maybe that's a question we can begin to answer, Allison.
So currently, if you have a power purchase agreement and it has lowered your utility bills, and you are eligible for a rate reduction incentive, so for example, your base electricity is 10 cents, and through the PPA, that amount of electricity you're purchasing at 8 cents, so you're saving 2 cents per kilowatt hour. If you're eligible for the 50% rate reduction incentive because it's outside an EPC, the housing authority would get to retain 1 cent per kilowatt hour for what they're purchasing. That is actually a line item in your op sub form. That's the 52723 form. So the way things are right now is because it's an op sub benefit, it ends up in your operating subsidy pool of money. There is a little bit of flexibility, and it's too complicated to get into the details of that right now. But in general, like, you're not going to make money off of a power purchase agreement because you're still going to have a bill to pay.
Okay, great. And Allison, if they did that as a lease revenue, like a ground lease revenue, where the PPA was going to a third party, so it's the other piece of that equation.
Then it depends how the contract is structured and how the money is being labeled, and we would need to handle that as a specific legal question, contract by contract.
Great. Okay. So the guidance is to follow up with your local HUD field office and get the ball
field
rolling. Yep.
Yep.
Perfect. Great. All right. Well, I think we have a couple of more questions on the technical side. One of those is looking for any insight on long-term maintenance costs and type of maintenance needed for a PV project. I think what we've heard from some of the examples, successful examples with a power purchase agreement or an EPC, is that typically it's a third-party owned and managed system. In that arrangement, the maintenance cost and the maintenance requirements are handled by a third party. And so that on a utility basis or on an expense basis, you're just paying for the utility or the power that's being delivered or provided by the power purchase agreement, or you've got an arrangement under an EPC that you're just paying a net cost that includes all of the ongoing operations and maintenance. If, however, you were to do a capital project where you did own the system outright and maybe got a low-interest loan or a grant or something to defray those costs, so it was a cost-effective decision for you, there could be maintenance costs that you'd want to undertake. So first off, it depends on what type of model you have, because the financing model does impact operations and maintenance costs and performance risks as well. And we're not going to go into all those different avenues, but keeping in mind that those are important factors to consider. The cost itself, though, in terms of the dollar amount, I think that's going to vary a lot by the system. It's going to vary a lot by its location, the size of the system, the type of equipment that's being used. So we can't provide a direct cost like per kilowatt installed per year or something, but those are important factors if you're going to own the system outright to plan for and to consider. So there's the resources that you see on this page on the webinar. There's a second set of additional external resources that we have available or that we've pointed to during the at some point during the webinar, and then some contacts. So I guess what I'd like to do is maybe turn it back over to Crystal to help wrap things up.
Sure. Thanks so much, Ben, and thanks to everyone who has provided such great information on this call. And thank you to everyone who asked so many questions. We will be sure to go through these questions and make sure that we've either answered them, or if we are able to answer them, we can send an answer to you directly later on once we determine what the correct answer is. So I want to make sure that we get to all of those, even those we may not have been able to answer fully right now. The webinar slides will also be available on the Renew 300 Renewable Energy HUD Exchange site, which was just listed in the first bullet of resources. So I'm going to move the slides back here. It's the Renew 300 on HUD Exchange. You can look there for all of the slides, a lot of the resources we've talked about today, and we will keep that page updated if there are additional updates to guidance or policy or anything like that around renewables at HUD. So feel free to check back. I also want to ask everyone to please fill out the sort of information review of this webinar. So when you I believe when you log out or you'll get an email asking for feedback on this webinar. We know that there's kind of a wide range of knowledge out there in terms of renewable energy and HUD policies. So we want to make sure that we're kind of hitting the right spot and providing the right information when we provide resources like this. So please do give us feedback. But I just wanted to thank everyone for joining. We had a great group. Please feel free to follow up with anyone who participated or anyone who presented, especially myself. I'll make sure to get your questions to the right people. And thanks again. And with that, we will end the presentation.